What if I told you that the Roman Empire didn't fall in 476 AD? What if its greatest transformation, its longest survival, began the moment the West was declared dead? Most people know how Rome collapsed, overrun by barbarians, betrayed by its own rot. But far fewer realize that a second Rome had already begun to rise. One that would endure not for decades, but for over 1,000 years, preserving ancient knowledge, commanding crusades, surviving plagues, fire, betrayal, and war. And in the end, falling not to its own weakness, but to the canons of a new world. This is the story of that forgotten empire. A state born in the ashes of crisis. One that called itself Roman, wrote in Greek, ruled with gold, and worshipped a crucified God. A civilization where emperors wept in golden thrones and peasants prayed beneath mosaics that shimmered like stars. This is the Byzantine Empire. But ask yourself, how does an empire survive its own death? And what does it take, not just to endure, but to reshape the very idea of Rome? Let us begin where few stories start, not in the height of power, but in the deep shadow of collapse. The 3rd century. The old empire is breaking. And yet, out of this slow disintegration, something begins to stir. Something that no one sees coming. Stop. Before you scroll away, ask yourself, why haven't you subscribed yet? You're watching history unfold right before you. The rise and fall of empires, the decisions that change the world, the legends that still shape our lives today. But this isn't just any history, it's the story of survival, of betrayal, and the cost of power. If you don't hit subscribe, you're turning your back on a journey that's about to get even darker, even more intense. What's stopping you? Do you really want to be the one left behind as we dive deeper into the fires of the past? Do you really want to miss out on what happens next? Don't wait. Don't hesitate. Subscribe now. Or if you won't, then at least come to the comments and tell us why. Let's hear your excuses. What's keeping you from being part of this? The story's not going to wait for you, so make the choice. History isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember. Let's keep remembering, together. The Roman world didn't collapse in a single day. It bled out, slowly, violently, publicly. Between the years 235 and 284 CE, the empire that once crowned the Mediterranean with its marble and law became unrecognizable. The borders weren't guarded, they were torn. Emperors no longer ruled for decades, they died by the month. And the idea that Rome was eternal? That was already a lie people stopped repeating out loud. This was the crisis of the 3rd century, not a downturn, not a brief instability, but a civilizational breakdown that nearly ended Rome as a living empire. What followed wasn't survival in the usual sense. It was something else. Something darker. A transformation that would leave the Roman world forever altered, and lay the first bricks of Byzantium. The year 235 marked a turning. The assassination of Emperor Severus Alexander, stabbed by his own soldiers while pleading for the lives of his mother and himself, set off a chain reaction no one could contain. Over the next 49 years, more than 20 emperors would rise and fall in a blur of betrayal, battlefield proclamations, and daggers unsheathed in imperial tents. Legions stationed at the frontiers, Germania, Syria, the Danube, turned into kingmakers and kingbreakers. The Praetorian Guard, originally tasked with guarding the emperor, became auctioneers of the throne. Civil war was no longer a crisis. It was a condition of power. At the same time, the empire fractured along its edges. In the west, the Gallic Empire emerged, a breakaway regime in Gaul and Britain. In the east, the city of Palmyra under Queen Zenobia declared autonomy, stretching its authority from Syria to Egypt. These weren't minor revolts. They were functioning shadow empires with their own bureaucracies, armies, and coins. And from beyond the frontiers, enemies poured in. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine. Goths raided deep into the Balkans. The Sassanid Persians advanced through Mesopotamia with frightening speed and cohesion. Rome's legions were no longer invincible. They were spread thin, outmatched, and leaderless. Economically, the empire buckled under hyperinflation. Silver coins were debased to worthlessness. Grain shipments failed. Entire cities depopulated, their baths and forums abandoned, their marble columns left to collapse beneath vines and silence. And then came plague. The so-called Plague of Cyprian, named after the bishop who chronicled it, swept through the empire like divine judgment. For nearly 2 decades, the disease devastated the population, paralyzing military recruitment, agriculture, and morale. By the late 260s, it was no longer clear that Rome was an empire at all. It was a name painted on walls that no longer stood. In this chaos rose a man named Diocles, born of obscure origins in the Roman province of Dalmatia. His father may have been a scribe or freedman, no one of consequence. He had no divine blood, no noble name, only an instinct for power. He clawed his way through the military ranks during the darkest years of the crisis, and in 284 CE, after the death of Emperor Numerian under mysterious circumstances, Diocles was proclaimed emperor by the army. He took a new name, Diocletian. Unlike his ephemeral predecessors, Diocletian didn't try to restore the empire by pretending it was still whole. He reshaped it into something else. Something stronger, colder, more rigid, like a bone that has broken and healed wrong but still holds weight. He split authority. He created the Tetrarchy, a system of 2 senior emperors, Augusti, and 2 junior ones, Caesars, governing the empire together. Diocletian ruled the east. His comrade Maximian took the west. This was not unity, it was managed division, a deliberate decentralization designed to match the empire's sprawling geography. He divided provinces into smaller administrative units. He separated military command from civil authority to reduce the risk of rebellion. He enacted sweeping tax reforms and attempted to stop inflation with the Edict on Maximum Prices, a price-fixing decree so extreme that it arguably caused more black markets than stability. But Diocletian's reforms weren't about economic success. They were about imperial control. He transformed the emperor from a mere mortal, a princeps, to a sacred figure, wrapped in ceremony, veiled from the people, worshipped like a Persian king. The imperial court became a theater of divinity. No more simple togas. Emperors now wore jewels and purple robes, and those who approached them prostrated themselves face first. This was no longer the Rome of the Senate. It was an empire ruled from the shadows of God. And in perhaps the most extraordinary act of all, Diocletian voluntarily abdicated in 305 CE, retiring to his palace in what is now split Croatia. It was the only peaceful transfer of imperial power in a century. But peace predictably didn't last. When Diocletian stepped down, the Tetrarchy began to unravel almost immediately. A new round of civil wars erupted. Emperors rose and fell like dust in the wind. Among the many contenders stood the son of Constantius, one of the former tetrarchs. His name was Constantine. In 312, outside the walls of Rome at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine prepared to fight his rival Maxentius. The night before the battle, according to later accounts, Constantine saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light and the words in hoc signo vinces, "In this sign you will conquer." Whether myth or political genius, what followed changed history. Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian Chi symbol on their shields. The next day he won a stunning victory. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber. And Constantine, a man raised in the traditions of pagan Rome, became the first Roman emperor to embrace Christianity. The following year he issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to Christians across the empire. And though he would not be baptized until his deathbed, Constantine favored the Christian faith as an imperial instrument. He built churches, funded bishops, and saw in the church something Rome had lost, a unifying idea. In 324 CE, Constantine emerged as sole emperor after defeating Licinius, his eastern rival. With the empire again under one ruler, Constantine faced a question that had haunted rulers since the crisis. Where should power live? He chose not Rome. Instead, he looked east, to the ancient city of Byzantium, situated on the Bosporus Strait, where Europe and Asia met. There, Constantine envisioned a capital not chained to the Senate, not tied to pagan temples, not haunted by the decaying grandeur of the old republic. He rebuilt the city with imperial scale, forums, palaces, walls, aqueducts. He called it Nova Roma, but it would soon be known by a different name, Constantinople. The city was Rome's heir, but it was something else too. A city of crossroads, of sacred purpose. Its skyline was not dominated by temples of Jupiter or Mars, but by Christian basilicas. Those statues of ancient gods still dotted its streets. The spiritual weight had shifted. It was not just a move of convenience. It was a symbolic rupture. The old Rome had been broken, tested, and found wanting. The new Rome, facing east, fortified, closer to the wealth of Asia, was the seat of something born from collapse. By the time of Constantine's death in 337, the foundations had been laid for a new kind of empire. It still called itself Roman. It still marched legions. But its soul had changed. It no longer worshipped Jupiter or Mars. It no longer trusted the Senate or the Forum. Its emperors ruled by divine right, surrounded by priests and icons. This was not the Republic of Cicero. This was not the Empire of Augustus. This was the embryo of Byzantium, an empire that had survived death by becoming something different. What Diocletian began with control, Constantine finished with belief. Together, though they never met, they stitched a broken world into a living one. And in doing so they built something that should not have lasted, but did. For over 1,000 years, the world had ended, and something else had survived it. Byzantium was not born in peace. It was born in ruin, and made from it a throne. Can a city be born holy? Not by prophecy, not by miracle, not by the visitation of gods, but by design, by ambition, by the hand of a man who saw that the world had already ended once and that the ruins of the old could be shaped into something both divine and defensible. Constantinople wasn't a miracle. It was a calculation, one that changed the shape of empires. What do you do after watching an empire bleed itself to near extinction? You don't rebuild. You redirect. Constantine understood that Rome as a city could no longer carry the weight of empire. It was too entrenched in its past, too bogged down by the Senate, by aristocratic inertia, by its own decay. So he looked east, not out of betrayal but out of clarity. In the small city of Byzantium, a Greek colonial outpost with deep roots and a commanding view of the Bosporus, Constantine saw possibility. He saw a new Rome rising not on tradition but on vision. He would not just move the capital. He would build it. And so, in 324 CE, construction began. The scale was impossible. The old city was scraped, expanded, and reshaped. Constantinople would echo the seven hills of Rome, not as mimicry but as symbolic succession. It would have forums modeled after Trajan and Augustus, not in reverence to their memory but to claim their legacy. There would be a Senate house, yes, but subordinate to the emperor's will. There would be aqueducts and colonnades, triumphal arches and hippodromes, not merely for entertainment, but to declare continuity in spectacle. And at its spiritual core stood the first iteration of the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. Humble compared to its later incarnation, but significant nonetheless. For the first time, the beating heart of imperial Rome was consecrated not to Jupiter or Mars, but to the Christian God. This was the birth of something new, an imperial capital where the altar now stood higher than the throne. But it wasn't enough to build. You had to fill it with meaning. Constantine and his successors plundered the empire's heartlands for relics and symbols. Obelisks from Egypt, statues from Athens, columns from Ephesus. Pagan gods stripped from their temples now stood silent in Christian courts, not as divine beings, but as trophies of a world conquered and reinterpreted. The city became a museum of Rome's own past, reorganized under a Christian sky. The symbolism was blunt. The past is here, but we've decided what it means now. Christian icons began to replace imperial busts in homes and public spaces. Relics of saints were placed beneath church altars. The imperial palace was flanked by chapels. And yet, pagan sculpture remained. The transition wasn't clean. It was messy, awkward, and political. Some doubted it then as we might now. Why hold on to pagan art while promoting Christian theology? Because Constantinople was not created for purity. It was created for control. The new empire was built to hold opposites in tension, to absorb contradiction and survive it. With geography and architecture secured, Constantine turned to ritual. He understood what Diocletian had already begun. If emperors could no longer rule through sheer force, they must rule through distance and awe. So the Eastern court became a theater of divinity. Emperors were no longer generals or administrators. They were vicars of God, robed in purple, seated on golden thrones raised on platforms. The ceremonies echoed Persian tradition, not Republican Rome. Courtiers bowed not out of etiquette, but out of theological necessity. To oppose the emperor was to stand against the divine order. The emperor did not speak. He was spoken to. His presence required preparation. Audiences were rare and protocol replaced spontaneity. And unlike the West, where power was often still contested by aristocratic families or rebellious generals, in the East, power became sacred performance. The city became a palace. The palace became a church. And the emperor became something in between, not a god but God's shadow on earth. This transformation wasn't accidental, was essential. Because without divinity there could be no authority. Not in a fractured, post-crisis world. At first, Constantinople's elite still spoke Latin. Its laws were Latin. Its coinage, its oaths, its military hierarchy, all in Latin. But it wouldn't last. The eastern provinces had always been more Greek than Roman in language and culture. From Alexandria to Antioch, from Ephesus to Nicomedia, the The rhythms of life were Hellenic. Christianity itself had spread largely through Greek-speaking regions. And slowly, inevitably, the language of empire changed. By the end of the 6th century, Latin was no longer the dominant tongue in Constantinople's courts or churches. It lingered in law like a ghost, but the living world had moved on. Sermons were Greek. Debates were Greek. Orders were issued in Greek. So why then did the Byzantines still call themselves Romans? Because Rome was not a language. Rome was a legitimacy. To abandon the name was to surrender the past. To keep it, even in a new tongue with new rituals and new faith, was to inherit its authority. They were not Latin Romans. They were Greek Romans. But in their eyes, still Romans nonetheless. Above all else, Constantine's choice of Byzantium was a military and economic masterstroke. Perched on a triangular peninsula, the city was surrounded by water on 3 sides: the Golden Horn to the north, the Sea of Marmara to the south, and the Bosphorus Strait to the east. This geography made the city almost impossible to besiege, especially before the advent of gunpowder. But it was more than defense. Constantinople stood at the crossroads of empire, where trade from the Silk Road flowed into Europe, where Black Sea grain met Aegean spice, where Persian silk passed Roman steel. To hold Constantinople was to hold the economic heartbeat of East and West. When critics ask why Byzantium didn't fall earlier, the answer isn't luck. It's position. When they ask why it held to the Roman name, the answer is strategy. Constantinople wasn't born to preserve the old. It was born to outlast it. Rome had been a republic, then an empire, then a memory. Constantinople was none of these things. It was an idea turned to stone, built by a man who believed that a throne could be made holy, if placed on the right hill under the right cross facing the right sea. In 385 CE, in a provincial town called Trier, a man was executed for believing the wrong thing about Jesus. His name was Priscillian and he was a bishop. He wasn't a heretic by his own reckoning. He taught chastity, fasting, and scripture study. But his views on the dual nature of Christ, and the female role in the church, deviated too far from what the state, now armed with bishops and blades, could accept. He was accused of sorcery and treason. Tried not in an ecclesiastical court, but a Roman one. He became the first Christian in history to be executed by other Christians for heresy. And in that moment, something ancient finally died. Was this still Rome? Or had belief become law? The Edict of Milan in 313 had legalized Christianity. But legalization is not harmony. By the time Constantine took full control of the empire, Christianity was no longer underground. It was multiplying and fragmenting. Dozens of interpretations of Christ's nature competed for supremacy. One faction, led by Arius, a priest from Alexandria, argued that Christ was divine, but created, subordinate to the Father. He had a beginning. He was not eternal, not equal. This idea spread like fire. It appealed to reason, to hierarchy. It preserved monotheism by diluting mystery. Other bishops raged. If Christ was not fully God, then the incarnation was a lie. If he was not eternal, then salvation was counterfeit. Constantine, now patron of a unified empire and a chaotic church, saw a problem not of theology but of order. In 325 he convened the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council in history. Not in Rome but in Bithynia, the heart of the East. Over 300 bishops gathered. Many bore the scars of past persecutions. And now they debated Christ's nature under the gaze of the emperor, seated on a golden throne robed in purple, presiding as an unbaptized catechumen. The result was the Nicene Creed, a declaration that Christ was begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. It was not a compromise. It was a weapon, a statement that would become the litmus test for imperial loyalty and spiritual truth alike. As historians, we must ask, was this theology, or the centralization of ideology for imperial utility? The answer, uncomfortably, is both. Constantine didn't care which side was right. He cared which side could stabilize his empire. A unified creed was easier to govern than a dozen competing truths. And that decision, made in robes, not rags, would echo across centuries of execution, excommunication, and empire. Following Nicaea, the Church was no longer a loose underground fellowship. It became a hierarchy, tethered to cities, wealth, and law. 5 cities rose to spiritual prominence: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Each had its bishop, its patriarch. Each believed it held the key to apostolic succession. Each was backed by local armies, tax networks, and imperial proximity. But 2 began to dominate: Rome, steeped in martyrdom and tradition, and Constantinople, new and imperial, increasingly the emperor's church. As Byzantium grew in stature, its patriarch claimed parity with Rome, not by age but by proximity to the throne. And when disputes arose, over feast days, heresies, or scriptural interpretation, it was often the emperor, not the bishop, who resolved them. This fusion of crown and mitre was not accidental. It was the birth of a system where heresy was treason, and doctrine could only survive if it could also rule. But not all emperors accepted this. In 361, Constantine's nephew Julian became emperor, a philosopher, a soldier, and a pagan. He was raised Christian, but disillusioned by court hypocrisy and doctrinal violence. In secret he studied Neoplatonism. He read Homer and Plotinus. He sacrificed at temples in the dead of night. When he came to power, he publicly rejected Christianity, the first emperor to do so since the faith had been embraced. He reopened temples, reinstated sacrifices, revived the priesthoods of Apollo, Dionysus, and Isis. But he did not persecute. Instead, he mocked Christians, promoted interreligious tolerance, and tried to outmatch the Church at its own game: charity, rhetoric, and moral authority. But the old gods were already dying. Julian's pagan revival never took hold. In 363 he was killed in a campaign against Persia, supposedly whispering with his last breath, "Thou hast conquered, Galilean." He was the last emperor of the old world. What followed was the Church without rival. If Constantine made Christianity legitimate and Julian tried to stop it, then Theodosius I finished the job. Reigning from 379 to 395, Theodosius was a fervent Nicene Christian, not merely in public, but in policy. He banned pagan sacrifices, closed temples, stripped priesthoods of funding. In 391, the Serapeum of Alexandria, one of the great temples of the ancient world, was destroyed by a Christian mob, not with imperial restraint, but with silent approval. He also ended the Olympic Games, not because they were trivial, but because they were pagan rituals disguised as sport. Theodosius declared Nicene Christianity the official religion of the empire. All other forms, including Arianism, Donatism, and Pelagianism, were treated as seditious. And when a bishop, Ambrose of Milan, excommunicated Theodosius for a massacre in Thessalonica, the emperor knelt in public penance, an unprecedented act that showed how far the church had come. It could now humble a Roman emperor. The balance had shifted. Rome no longer persecuted Christianity. Christianity now defined Rome. By the end of the 4th century, something unique had taken form. The emperor was no longer just imperator. He was Pontifex Maximus, divinely guided, a vessel of orthodoxy, protector of the creed. The church did not sit above the state, nor did the state replace the church. Instead, they formed a dyad, 2 organs, 1 body. A model later scholars would call Caesaropapism, where the emperor governed the church's affairs, summoned councils, enforced doctrine, and judged heresy not as sin but as sedition. To modernize, the contradictions are sharp. How could a faith born in persecution become so quick to persecute? How could a church founded on the humility of Christ serve emperors who wore gold and demanded prostration? And why did Byzantium, so fragmented in belief, so prone to internal strife, not collapse? Because belief, once weaponized, could not only convert, it could command. Something was lost in this fusion, but something was gained. Gone was the wandering preacher of Galilee. In his place stood a creed, a council, a court. Gone was the emperor as warrior statesman. In his place, a figurehead of holiness and hierarchy. This wasn't Rome anymore. Not in the way Cicero would have known. But it wasn't something entirely new either. It was the Byzantine paradox. A world that held the past like a relic, even as it forged a future from its own contradictions. It felt like a funeral without a body. There was no last stand. No glorious death. Just a name slipping quietly into ash. In the year 476, the Western Roman Empire died. Not in fire, not in conquest, but in replacement. The emperor in Italy, a boy with an inherited title, was forced to abdicate. The man who dethroned him, Odoacer, didn't take the title for himself. He didn't even claim to be Caesar. He just handed the imperial regalia back to Constantinople, as if to say, we're done pretending. And in that silence, a world ended. To understand the shock of 476, we have to step back into what the West had become. The Western Roman Empire, once stretching from Britain to North Africa, had been unraveling for decades. By the early 5th century, its legions were shadows. Its roads cracked. Its taxes uncollected. Its emperors, frequently puppets of powerful generals, were figures in name only. Germanic tribes no longer feared Rome. They occupied it. The Visigoths sacked Rome in 410. The Vandals took Carthage in 439. By 450, the western provinces were a patchwork of warlords and war-weary civilians. In Britain, the legions had long since departed, leaving local leaders to fend off Saxon raiders. In Spain, Visigothic kings minted their own coins. In Gaul, the Franks were not Romanizing. They were expanding. And in Africa, the Vandal fleet controlled Rome's grain supply. Still, the idea of Rome lingered. In senates too afraid to speak openly. In churches whose liturgy still named the emperor. In a city that once ruled the world, now begging for tribute. And then came the final whisper. In 476, the barbarian general Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, the teenage emperor of the West. He didn't murder him. He simply retired him and sent the imperial insignia to the east. It was over. No proclamation. No last gasp. Only absence. Why did the West fall so completely while the East remained standing? Historians still argue. Was it the economy? The lack of urban centers? The reliance on mercenaries? Or was it something deeper? A kind of internal rot, spiritual and administrative? A system that could no longer remember what made it Roman? Or was the East simply more ruthless? Romulus Augustulus. Even his name felt ironic. Romulus, like the founder of Rome. Augustulus, Little Augustus. A diminutive title for a diminished emperor. He was likely 14. A boy placed on the throne by his father, the general Orestes, in a desperate bid to hold power. He lasted a year. When Odoacer, leader of a federation of barbarian troops long employed by the Western army, marched on Ravenna, the court crumbled. Orestes was executed. Romulus was spared. What? No one knows. Perhaps Odoacer saw no need to stain his hands with imperial blood. Perhaps the boy was already irrelevant. Odoacer didn't claim the purple. He didn't crown himself emperor. Instead, he declared himself king of Italy and told the Eastern emperor, Zeno, that one emperor was enough. It was not a hostile usurpation. It was a resignation letter, signed in silence. And the empire, as it had existed for centuries, became myth. The Eastern court, ruling from the palaces of Constantinople, received the imperial regalia of the West with careful choreography. They didn't mourn. They didn't rage. They accepted the gesture and declared the empire reunified. Not with armies, with words. They recognized Odoacer as the ruler of Italy, as long as he ruled in the name of the Eastern Emperor. It was a diplomatic masterpiece. Let the West collapse, but never admit it. Let others hold land, but remind them who holds legitimacy. This was how Byzantium would survive. Not always with armies, but with claims, with titles, with rituals, with the refusal to concede that anything was ever truly lost. But was this survival or betrayal? Why didn't Byzantium save the West? Why didn't it send legions to protect Rome, to defend the cradle of empire? The truth is, by the mid-5th century, Constantinople saw the West not as a partner, but as a liability. A realm too expensive to defend, too fractured to trust. The East had its own problems. Invasions from the Huns. Religious wars over Christ's nature. Court intrigues that could topple emperors overnight. Saving the West would have meant sacrificing the East. And in the calculus of survival, Byzantium chose itself. So the Western Empire died, not with fire but with neglect. And the Eastern Empire, what we now call Byzantium, went on, not unchanged, but unbroken. It still claimed to be Rome. Its laws were still Roman. Its emperors still wore the purple and crowned themselves Augustus and Basilius. Its coin, the solidus, still bore the image of imperial authority. But its soul was changing. It spoke Greek. It prayed in churches built where temples once stood. Its power lay not in old senators but in eunuchs and generals. Its spirit, once forged in the Republic, disciplined by conquest, was now steeped in theology, ritual, and survival. We often speak of Rome as if it fell. But in truth it was reassembled, stone by stone, creed by creed, in a new form. The city of Romulus and Augustus became the city of Basil and Justinian. The Senate's rostra were replaced by the throne room of the great palace. The gods of Olympus fell silent, replaced by icons of saints and martyrs. The West faded into legend. But in the East, the myth lived on, draped in gold, spoken in Greek, defended with fire. Byzantium did not simply survive. It watched the world burn and learned how to rule the ashes. It began not with a battle but with a whisper. The Western Roman Empire was not slain by a sword. It was abandoned. A hollow shell kept together by fragile paper promises. Its last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was a boy who never knew what it meant to be emperor. His reign ended in quiet surrender, not to the legions, but to the barbarian general Odoacer. And in that surrender, Rome did not collapse in fire. It collapsed in silence. No last stand. No glorious defense. Rome simply stopped being Roman. This was not a battle lost. This was the death of an idea. Now, across the narrow sea in the heart of Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire watched, not with mourning but with calculation. Constantinople, the jewel of the East, had been born from 1,000 ambitious dreams. It stood not only as the new capital but as the last defense of the Roman world. Unlike the decaying walls of Rome, Constantinople's walls were born of necessity, of an empire that knew the fate of the West could not be repeated. The Theodosian walls, completed in the early 5th century, were a physical manifestation of empire, impenetrable, unshakable. A double line of fortifications with a moat that stretched out in defense, stretching across the peninsula, with 96 imposing towers. These walls, built by Theodosius II, were not simply bricks and stone. They were a symbol, a refusal to allow what had happened in the West to happen here. For 1,000 years they would hold the enemy back. For 1,000 years, they would become the last great defense of the Roman legacy. Rome had fallen because it had no walls left to build. But Byzantium's walls were built with the resilience of empire and the humiliation of failure. Why didn't Byzantium fall earlier? Why did the East hold on to Rome so tightly, even as the West crumbled away? The answer is both simple and brutal. Byzantium held to Rome not out of nostalgia but out of survival. The walls didn't just defend a city, they defended the idea that Rome could be reborn. Byzantium was not bound to the West's collapsing dreams. It was bound to its own ruthless pragmatism. Where the West died, Byzantium simply adapted. As the West fell, Byzantium consolidated its wealth, shored up its resources, and found new strength in its most vital provinces. The gold solidus, introduced by Constantine, became the bedrock of Byzantium's economic system, a stable coin that carried unmatched weight across the Mediterranean and beyond. While the Western economy was riddled with inflation, Byzantium's currency remained steady, unbroken by external pressures. But the solidus wasn't the only lifeblood. There was the grain of Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, which flowed continuously into Constantinople, ensuring that the city's heart never starved, no matter what crises gripped the empire. Taxation reforms in the Eastern Empire brought in stable revenues. While the West bled gold from every plundered province, Byzantium turned taxation into an art, organizing provinces into tax-efficient units, enforcing consistent collection, and ensuring that local elites paid their due without causing rebellion. And as the West struggled to feed itself, Byzantium did not suffer. The city of Constantinople became the marketplace of the Mediterranean. Goods, merchants, spices, and arms all flowed through its waterways, turning the empire's heart into the wealthiest and most powerful point of exchange in the ancient world. But in the back corridors of the palace and in the quiet corners of the church, there was a question asked with increasing frequency. Why hold on to Rome? Why keep wearing the mantle of the Roman Empire when the name was no longer earned? The emperor's robes were stitched with old promises, promises of unity, of an eternal empire, of a greatness that seemed so far in the past it could hardly be grasped by a world that was already moving into a new era. But for those in Constantinople, it wasn't just about the name. It was about legitimacy. It was about the idea that even as the West had fallen, they, in the East, still held the flame. They believed that Rome could not simply be abandoned, not because of sentimental attachment, but because the idea of Rome was the foundation of their rule. Without Rome they would lose everything. The heart of the empire had shifted eastward, but the throne still belonged to Rome. As historians, we are left with this uncomfortable truth. Byzantium didn't merely survive by chance or luck. It survived because it was ruthlessly pragmatic. Where the West died from internal rot and external collapse, Byzantium adapted, shifted, and built a new vision of what an empire could be. But this wasn't Rome as it had been. This was Rome as it needed to be. In the end, the story of Byzantium wasn't one of luck. It was a story of ruthless survival, of an empire that stayed alive long enough to remake itself, long enough to see a future that would outlast its past. The West had fallen. The East had risen. But in the rubble, Rome was still alive. The flames of rebellion are always the last sign of empire in decline. And in January of 532, the Nika riots, a massacre of tens of thousands of lives, showed the world how close Byzantium was to its own death. In the streets of Constantinople, the city that was the last great Roman city, a single spark, a sports rivalry, ignited a blaze of unimaginable violence. The people, angry at their rulers, demanded more than just a show of sport. They demanded retribution. They tore the streets apart, chanting, Nika, victory, victory over the emperor. It was a call for revolution. It was a call for the end of Justinian's reign. But this was no ordinary emperor. Justinian had not inherited his empire from a long line of powerful kings. His rise had been a grind, a steady climb from peasant stock to imperial throne. Born in 482, the nephew of Emperor Justinian I, he learned early on how to navigate the court and how to manipulate the symbols of imperial authority. And beside him stood Theodora, the woman who had once danced on the streets, a woman of humble origins with a reputation that could have ruined a lesser emperor. Her past was scandalous. A former actress and dancer, once a woman of the theater's darkened corners, and yet she was also a woman of extraordinary intelligence, political acumen, and unmatched resolve. Their union wasn't merely one of love, it was one of power, a partnership that would reshape the very fabric of the empire. Their marriage had raised a question of legitimacy. Could an emperor, even one as determined as Justinian, rule effectively with a wife whose past seemed to echo the scandals of a world that Rome had left behind? But Theodora was no mere consort. She understood power, and in those first years of their reign she guided Justinian's decisions on matters of law, church reform, and the welfare of the people. She understood better than anyone else the importance of symbolic governance, to give the people not just food but something to believe in. And her counsel was vital when the Nika riots threatened to tear the empire asunder. The riots began as a dispute over chariot races, two factions, the Blues and the Greens, fiercely loyal to their respective teams. It escalated quickly into political unrest, with the crowds using the riot as a means to attack Justinian's rule. The emperor had already alienated many of the aristocrats and religious figures in his court, and the people, already burdened by taxes and discontent, saw the rebellion as an opportunity to reclaim power. The city exploded into violence. Buildings were burned, churches desecrated, the emperor's palace besieged. Thousands of rebels surged through the streets, demanding the abdication of Justinian. The emperor, seeing the entire empire at risk of collapse, was ready to flee. But Theodora, with a vision for the empire that went far beyond the moment, made one of the most legendary speeches in history. In the face of total collapse, she said, "The purple is the best shroud." In that moment, she not only held Justinian's hand, but also the empire's future. With her urging, Justinian gathered his forces. He was ready to make a brutal decision. He ordered his generals, led by Belisarius, to march into the hippodrome and slaughter thousands of rioters. What followed was a violent but effective suppression. The city was restored to order, and Justinian's rule remained intact. But the cost was high. The dead were counted in the tens of thousands. The city was scarred, and the echoes of the Nika riots would linger for years. This was no victory. This was a survival. Justinian and Theodora, united in the face of a crisis, had crushed the rebellion, but the world around them would never be the same. The Nika riots would have lasting consequences on the cultural and architectural landscape of the Byzantine Empire. To demonstrate his resolve and imperial strength, Justinian commissioned the construction of the most magnificent church the world had ever seen, the Hagia Sophia. This was more than just a building. This was a symbol. The Hagia Sophia would embody the shift from a pagan past to a Christian future, from a divided Rome to a unified Christian empire under the leadership of the emperor. The church was designed by the architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, men of extraordinary skill, who crafted a structure that seemed almost impossible to build. The dome, huge and suspended, appeared as though it was hanging from heaven itself. The use of light and space in the Hagia Sophia was revolutionary. The light that flooded into the sanctuary symbolized the divine presence of God, while the soaring dome and massive arches seemed to push heaven and earth closer together. But this was not simply a religious statement. It was a political one. Justinian was no longer just a Roman emperor. He was a divinely appointed ruler, and the Hagia Sophia was the seat of that divinity. Through its construction, he made clear that the Byzantine emperor was both ruler and protector of the Christian faith. Yet, the building's very grandeur was a reminder of what had been lost, of the Roman temples and monuments that had once graced the landscape of the ancient empire, but which had now been replaced with symbols of Christian imperial power. But as the dust settled from the Nika riots and the Hagia Sophia's dome reached toward heaven, one question lingered. Why didn't Byzantium fall earlier? The West had fallen. The empire had split. The barbarians had ravaged the borders. Why was Byzantium still here, standing tall in a world of ruins? The answer lies in what Justinian and Theodora understood more than anything: power and persistence. Unlike the West, the Eastern Empire had adapted. It was more flexible, more ruthless, more willing to reinvent itself when it needed to. Justinian's laws were an anchor. His religious decisions brought the church and the emperor together in a way that the West had never seen. And Theodora's strategic mind, unbothered by gender or reputation, made sure that the empire could survive in even its most dangerous moments. Byzantium held on to Rome, not because it was loyal to the old world, but because it knew how to survive in the new one. And so, with fire and law, Justinian and Theodora stood as the last great heirs of the Roman Empire. The Hagia Sophia stood as a beacon of power and faith, a symbol of survival for a civilization that had seen everything slip away before. And yet, it was not the building, but the ambition that created it, that held the empire together. The West had burned, but Byzantium endured. and it would continue to burn with fire and flame. In the year 532, the streets of Constantinople ran red. Not from blood spilled in battle, but from the sheer force of the Nika riots, a civil unrest that threatened to bring down the entire empire. Thousands were slaughtered. The city itself nearly burned to the ground. And for a moment, it seemed as though the emperor's reign was at an end. Justinian, that ambitious ruler who had rebuilt the empire with the fervor of a man half his age, stood facing the end, not with glory but with collapse. And yet, it was not the flames of rebellion that burned him. It was the flames of survival. Theodora, his wife, his queen, made the most significant decision of their reign. The purple is a fine shroud. Together they fought for their future. The Nika riots weren't just a rebellion against one emperor, they were an assault on the empire's identity. The people wanted more than vengeance, they wanted a new order. One that would overthrow the old ways. One that would tear down the empire as Justinian had rebuilt it. And Justinian, knowing this, made a ruthless decision. The riots were crushed, and in the aftermath he began to reshape the empire with law as its backbone. His most enduring legacy was the creation of the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. This monumental legal code became the skeleton of Byzantine governance. It unified the empire's legal landscape, making the emperor not just a ruler by force but by law. For Justinian, this wasn't simply a matter of order. It was a means of legitimacy, a way to solidify the Roman ideal in an empire that was anything but Roman anymore. The Corpus Juris Civilis served as the basis for later European legal systems, but it was far more than just a legal document. It was an assertion of power. It was the emperor's will written into the framework of everyday life. Justinian, who could never return to Rome in its former glory, ensured that Rome's ideas and laws would continue to shape the world, in a new form. Why didn't Byzantium fall earlier? Why did it hold on to Rome so long? The answer is in Justinian's vision. Where others saw an empire dying, Justinian saw the framework of a new world. By holding to Roman law, he ensured that the Roman ideal, and all that Rome stood for, wouldn't fade into history. He used law as a lifeline, not only to bind his empire together but to give it meaning. The legal code wasn't just a response to the crisis of the Nika riots, it was a response to the chaos of a fractured world. The Nika riots had shown the fragility of Justinian's rule, but Justinian was no fool. He knew that a ruler without power was a ruler who would soon be dethroned. And so, after the chaos of 532, he turned to one of his most fearsome weapons, Greek fire. Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary weapon capable of burning even on water, was the empire's answer to the military threats that loomed on every border. Its exact composition is still debated today, but in the hands of Byzantine soldiers, it was a devastating force. The weapon allowed Constantinople to repel invasions, from the Arabs at sea to the Kievan Rus trying to scale the walls. Greek fire wasn't just a tool for military defense. It was a symbol of Byzantine power, a reminder that Byzantium had the power to control its borders. But Greek fire wasn't the only weapon Justinian wielded. His faith was just as powerful. Religious enforcement became one of Justinian's most divisive tactics. While the church had already gained immense power, Justinian codified it. He used the church to reinforce his authority, ensuring that religious leaders were not only spiritual advisors, but also political enforcers of imperial will. The emperor ruled not just as the emperor of Rome, but as the emperor of Christianity. With each decree, Justinian extended his influence over both the temporal and spiritual realms. Under his reign, heresy was not simply a theological error. It was treason. Orthodoxy became a cornerstone of state policy. Whether it was Arianism or Monophysitism, Justinian aggressively sought to bring religious unity to his empire, enforcing decrees that often led to persecution. By the mid-6th century, Constantinople had transformed into the most vibrant city in the Mediterranean world. A city of ambition, wealth, and influence, but also one of extreme disparity. The forums of Constantinople were not only sites for commerce and debate, but also places where ideas and power collided. At the heart of the city stood the Forum of Constantine, where politicians, traders, and citizens gathered. Here, imperial edicts were read aloud, and the latest laws were discussed, often heatedly. The baths, once part of Roman culture, had become centerpieces of public life. They weren't simply for hygiene. They were places to socialize, to plot, and to network. Political deals were made in steam-filled rooms, and businessmen sealed contracts while scrubbed clean of the day's grime. Bakeries, too, had become symbols of empire. Bread was not just sustenance, it was control. The state-controlled wheat supply ensured that no one went hungry, but it also allowed the emperor to dictate the price of life itself. Grain from Egypt flowed into the city's granaries, and bread became the medium of loyalty. If the emperor controlled the bread, he controlled the people. The markets of Constantinople were bustling, teeming with exotic goods from Africa, India, and even China. The city was a trade hub, its commerce unmatched by any in the world. Silk, spices, and luxury items filled the streets, but it was the exchange of ideas and power that made the Byzantine marketplace the true heart of the empire. Constantinople was both opulent and oppressive. It was a city where faith and politics were intertwined, where commerce supported both survival and empire, and where Greek fire and church decrees were as integral to the empire as laws and bread. Why didn't Byzantium fall earlier? Why did the empire survive while the West crumbled? The truth is that Byzantium was no longer just a Roman empire. It had reinvented itself, a fusion of ancient authority and new faith, of old Roman power and Christian purpose. Where Rome had been an empire of soldiers and senators, Byzantium became an empire of priests and generals. A new identity was forged, not in battle but in bureaucracy, law, and faith. Justinian didn't just hold on to Rome. He transformed it. He reinvented it for a new age, but at what cost? The Nika riots had shown that the people could burn everything to the ground. But Justinian and Theodora had rebuilt it, with law, faith, and fire. But what would be lost in the process? What would be sacrificed to preserve a broken empire? Let me ask you something. What would you do if you were watching an empire on the verge of collapse? An empire that held the power of the past, the weight of the world, and the burden of survival, and yet still teetered on the brink? You're witnessing history unfold, and this story, these moments, will never come again. If you're still here, if you're feeling the gravity of what's at stake, you know this isn't just entertainment. It's a legacy and you are part of it. So don't leave. Don't wait. Hit subscribe now and become part of the journey as we keep telling stories that need to be heard. For those of you who won't subscribe, tell us why. What's keeping you from hitting that button? What's holding you back from joining a community that lives and breathes history? Come on, enter the comments and tell us. Let's have an honest conversation about it. But I warn you, this is more than a video series. This is a chance to be part of something bigger. There was a time when the map of Justinian's empire glowed with imperial gold. Its borders stretched from the Spanish peninsula to the banks of the Euphrates. Every corner of the Mediterranean lay at his feet, reconquered, reclaimed, reformed. But no map lasts forever. Soon the once glistening lines would turn to ash and blood. For in the chase to restore Rome to its former glory, something vital was lost. The ambition that had rebuilt an empire would eventually tear it apart. By the time Justinian's forces had stretched across Africa, Italy, and Spain, fate had already begun to work against him. It didn't come in the form of invaders but in disease. The plague of Justinian, which struck in 541 CE, would devastate the empire in ways no foreign army could. At the height of the empire's ambitions, a plague unlike any before it swept through the Mediterranean. Originating in Egypt, it hit Constantinople first. The city was overwhelmed, its bustling streets stilled by death. Thousands died every day, and for the first time in centuries, the great capital of the East stood still. The plague was not just a disease. It was a blow to Justinian's labor force, a depletion of taxpayers, a reduction of soldiers, and a catastrophic hit to economic output. The empire could not even maintain its bread supply, let alone its armies. The surge of prosperity that had come with his reconquest was cut short. But what really hurt was that Justinian didn't just face a natural disaster. The plague undermined the very foundation of his empire, its ability to recover. The empire's economic structure, built on land taxes, collapsed as peasants died, and landowners struggled to maintain control. The empire's demographic resilience, the very thing that had allowed it to endure through hundreds of years of war and civil strife, was shattered. 2/3 of the population of Constantinople perished. And in their wake, the question lingered: could Justinian's ambition survive a catastrophe like this? Why didn't Byzantium fall right then? Why didn't Justinian surrender to the weight of the world? It's tempting to think it was just luck. But the reality is far more ruthless. Byzantium was built for survival. It had endured the fall of the West and the plague's devastation. It had recovered before. But this time it wasn't just the enemy at the gates. It was the enemy within, an empire that had simply reached too far. As the plague ravaged his empire, Justinian had no choice but to continue his wars of reconquest. The dream of reuniting the Roman world still drove him, but the human cost was staggering. Belisarius, the emperor's greatest general, was called upon once again to take North Africa from the Vandals. His victory was swift and decisive, but the military success was also fleeting. The wars didn't stop there. Justinian, still burning with ambition, ordered Belisarius to march through Italy, recapturing it from the Ostrogoths. In Italy, however, the campaign dragged on. Belisarius fought hard battles with little support. He was forced to leave the conquered lands vulnerable, only for the Goths to rise again. His forces were spread thin and his health faltered. The cost of war was becoming clear, and it wasn't just the battlefield. In each conquered territory, the economy was decimated, the people were overtaxed, and the infrastructure was destroyed. The ambitious dream of reconquest, in the beginning so vibrant and full of promise, now became a grind, a slow crawl to exhaustion. The burnout was real. Not just for the men in armor, but for the empire itself. Justinian's attempts to restore Roman power were beginning to take a toll on his own imperial resources. His troops were exhausted. His subjects were weary. And his economy was draining. But the greatest challenge was still looming. Justinian's empire wasn't only stretched across the Mediterranean. He faced the Persians to the east. 4 years, the Persian Empire had been a constant threat, its armies pushing into Byzantine territory, trying to undermine the Eastern Front. By 540, Justinian's forces were fighting on two fronts. In the west, trying to hold on to conquered lands in Italy, and in the east, fighting Sassanid Persia, which had never been a mere nuisance. The war against Persia drained the empire's reserves. Belisarius was again called to the east, but by now the empire had no more breathing room. Justinian's forces were stretched too thin, and both wars required constant attention, constant sacrifices, but they couldn't win them both. By the mid-540s, the Persians had pushed into Syria, taking Antioch and Antioch's wealth with it. But in the west, Italy was still embroiled in constant warfare against the Goths, and Rome itself was still far from secure. How did Byzantium survive this? Was it luck, or was it simply the result of a ruler pushing an empire too far? How does an empire survive when its soldiers are dead, its coffers empty, and its lands bleeding? Perhaps it's not about what Byzantium did right, but what it did wrong. Perhaps the lesson is about knowing when ambition has outpaced capacity. Justinian's ambition was unsustainable, but he didn't know when to stop. In the end, it wasn't losses on the battlefield that brought the empire to its knees, it was exhaustion. The constant campaigns in Italy, Africa, and Persia drained the human capital of Byzantium. The plague hit hard and the wars never ended. The empire tried to do too much at once. By the time Justinian's reign came to a close in 565, the empire was in ruins. It had lost so much in the process of reclaiming. Rome was never truly restored. The dream was burned out. The empire had become a shadow of its former self, forced to wade through the rubble of its own ambition. And yet, the core of Byzantium, that stubborn will to survive, was still intact. The empire didn't collapse because of failure. It collapsed because of exhaustion. Was Byzantium destined to survive longer than the West because it had more resilience? Or did it simply outlive its ambition? The empire had greatness, but it could not keep pushing beyond its limits without consequence. The truth of Byzantium's survival isn't about one man's dreams. It's about the empire's capacity to endure, even when it seemed the weight of the world had become too much to bear. The empire did not fall because it was defeated. It fell because it had been overextended, its people exhausted. It was a slow death, a grind that no one saw coming. The map that once glowed with imperial gold, stretching across the Mediterranean like a crown of cities, now lay torn and stained with ash and blood. Justinian's conquests had been vast, brilliant in their scope, but by the time his reign ended in 565, the empire had already begun to show cracks. It wasn't an immediate collapse, no dramatic final blow. It was slower. It was the slow erosion of strength, the exhaustion of an empire that had stretched too thin. A map once dotted with imperial borders from Spain to the Euphrates now looked more like a patchwork, stitched together by dreams that could no longer hold. Justinian was an emperor like no other. His vision for the Roman world had been all-encompassing. But what happens when that vision dies with its creator? What happens when the ruthless ambition of one man fades into the hands of lesser rulers? After Justinian's death in 565, his empire was left with rulers who were unable, or unwilling, to carry his grand ambitions forward. The successors that followed were weakened, not by their own failures, but by the very system Justinian had built. The sheer weight of his reforms, religious, military, and legal, had drained the empire's resources. His conquests in Italy, Africa, and Spain had left exhausted armies, and with the plague of Justinian still fresh in memory, the empire was too fragile to bear the cost of constant wars and uprisings. The political instability that followed was palpable. A string of short-lived emperors with little political or military experience took the throne. Their reigns were marked by succession crises, court intrigue, and external threats. The empire, once formidable, had turned into a game of political survival, where the throne was won by schemes rather than strength. Why didn't Byzantium collapse under these leaders? Why didn't the empire fall apart completely? The answer lies in continuity. The structure of Byzantium, no matter how weakened, was resilient. But beneath the surface it was rotting. The weight of Justinian's ambition, though monumental, had come at a cost. And now the new rulers could do nothing but hold the line. But in holding that line, they ignored the cracks, the underlying tensions between East and West, Greek and Latin, imperial ambition and practical governance. The wounds of the West were now permanent. Italy, once the jewel of the Roman Empire, had been devastated in Justinian's wars. Africa, conquered from the Vandals, was still recovering. And yet, it was the East that continued to pulse with life, though with growing pains. By the end of the 6th century, the language of the empire was no longer Latin. It was Greek. This wasn't a sudden shift. It had been a long, gradual process that stretched back to Justinian's reign. But after his death, the shift was accelerated. The Greek-speaking provinces had always been more culturally dominant. The Eastern Mediterranean had a long history of Greek influence, stretching back to the time of Alexander the Great. By the time of Justinian's death, the Greek language had taken over both church and court. The administrative language of the empire shifted completely. The Latin-speaking West became more of a memory. This change wasn't just linguistic. It was cultural, political, and symbolic. The shift to Greek marked the end of the old Roman world, and the birth of something distinctly Byzantine. No longer did the empire hold on to its Roman identity. It was now defined by Greek customs, Greek bureaucracy, and Greek imperial structures. And with that came the question: was this the inevitable evolution of Rome, or was it a betrayal? Was this a loss, or was it simply the natural adaptation of a fractured empire? It's tempting to see this shift as a betrayal. The empire was built on Latin after all. But in reality, the shift to Greek wasn't about abandoning Rome, but about adapting to survive. Justinian's great empire had already outgrown the Roman foundations, and it was now building a new identity, one rooted in the East, where Greek was the language of culture, commerce, and law. Byzantium was no longer Rome, but it was still an empire. And that empire needed a language that was flexible, resilient, and adaptable to the challenges of the coming centuries. While the political center struggled, and the emperor's ambitions began to fray, life in the countryside continued on. Peasants, who made up the majority of the population, were the backbone of the Byzantine economy. Without them, the empire could not function. Yet, they were often forgotten in the grandeur of imperial politics. Agriculture was the lifeblood of the empire, but it was becoming more difficult to sustain. With wars, plagues, and taxation draining the land, peasants struggled to survive. In the early years of Justinian's successors, the themes, military administrative districts, had begun to take shape. These themes were designed to provide stability in times of military crisis. Soldiers were given land in return for military service, creating a system that was both defensive and agricultural. But by the time the empire had been stretched thin, the themes became increasingly unstable, as local governors struggled to maintain order and defend their territories from external invaders. In Asia Minor, for instance, the agricultural system was under constant threat from Slavic invasions, while Arab raids were a regular occurrence in the Aegean. The peasantry, once seen as the backbone of the empire, now became exhausted, their labor contributing to an empire that was growing less and less able to protect its lands. How did Byzantium survive these pressures? Why didn't it crumble completely? In a sense, the answer lies in the resilience of the peasants. Despite the hardships the Byzantine rural life endured, farmers, while increasingly overtaxed and exploited, kept the empire alive in ways the emperors couldn't. Without them, the heart of Byzantium would have stopped beating. But it wasn't enough. The exhaustion was widespread. Even the peasants, whose labor was the empire's lifeblood, were slowly becoming disillusioned. It's easy to look at Byzantium's struggle and wonder, why didn't they just collapse? Why didn't they give up? The reality is far more complex. Byzantium wasn't simply lucky, it was relentlessly stubborn. But stubbornness can only take an empire so far. Eventually, ambition outpaces endurance, and what is built by force eventually crumbles from within. What do you do when your gods, your gold, and your soldiers all fall silent? When the imperial banners fly high, but the winds of fate are no longer in your favor? For Heraclius, the answer was simple: you fight. But even the strongest sword can break in battle. Even the mightiest emperor can only hold a crumbling empire together for so long. The Eastern Roman Empire, now known to history as Byzantium, had already been stretched thin. After Justinian's reign, the empire began to fragment under the weight of plague, war, and overreach. The Persians pushed from the east while the barbarians threatened in the west. The empire teetered on the edge of collapse. It was in this cauldron of crisis that Heraclius emerged in 610, a soldier emperor determined to save a dying empire. At the dawn of his reign, Heraclius faced a choice: to continue down the path of the past or forge a new future. His answer was radical. He reformed the military and shifted power from the aristocracy to the provincial armies, the soldiers who owned land and fought to protect it. This would become the backbone of his military reforms. The theme system, a unique Byzantine approach where military commanders also took on civilian roles, blending military and administrative control in a decentralized system. It was a necessary response to the empire's weakening central authority. The theme system was built to ensure that local forces could defend their land without waiting for orders from a distant court. But there was a cost. The empire's centralized bureaucracy was weakened, and the control of the emperor became more fragile as military governors gained more independent power. Heraclius wasn't just fighting the external threats. His reforms required him to confront the empire's internal divisions, a task that would leave a lasting mark on Byzantium. Why didn't Byzantium fall earlier? Why did it survive all this time even when it seemed it had no chance? It wasn't just about the imperial strength of Heraclius. It was the resilience of the people. The willingness to adapt, to reinvent when survival was the only goal. Heraclius may have been a soldier at heart, but his reforms were also the result of a state forced to innovate, a pivot to survival. As Heraclius began to enact his reforms, he turned his attention to the Persians, who had long been a persistent threat on the empire's eastern frontier. The Sassanid Persians, under their king Khosrow II, had gained ground in the 7th century and now stood as Byzantium's greatest enemy. In 614, the Persians captured Jerusalem and stole one of the empire's most sacred relics, the true cross. The loss of the true cross was not just a military defeat, it was an emotional and spiritual blow to the Byzantine people. The true cross was a symbol of Christ's victory over death, and its theft by the Persians was seen as a humiliation. Heraclius, emboldened by his reforms and determined to reclaim his empire's dignity, launched a decisive campaign to take back the true cross and expel the Persians from Byzantine territories. He marched east, leading his armies with courage and determination, fighting through mountains and deserts and winning battle after battle. Finally, in 627, after years of war, Heraclius defeated Khosrow II at the Battle of Nineveh. The Persians were driven back, and the true cross was restored to Jerusalem. The victory was a moment of triumph, a vindication of Heraclius's reforms and military strategy. Yet it was only a brief respite. Was this the beginning of the end? Heraclius had won. But the cost of victory was tremendous. The empire's resources had been exhausted. The Persians were not finished. And even more dangerous, something new and unforeseen was rising from the desert. In the year 630, as Heraclius celebrated his victory over the Persians and the return of the true cross, a new threat was emerging, one that would change the course of history: Islam. The rise of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula was a shock to the Byzantine Empire. The Prophet Muhammad had died in 632, but his successors, the Rashidun Caliphate, rapidly united the disparate Arab tribes and launched a military campaign that would soon threaten the entire Mediterranean world. In 636, just a few years after the Persian defeat, the Byzantine Empire lost Syria to the Muslim forces at the Battle of Yarmouk. It was a decisive defeat. The empire had already been weakened by years of war, and now it faced a new, fierce enemy that was relentless in its advance. Palestine fell next. Then, in 642, Egypt, once the breadbasket of the empire, was lost to the Muslims as well. For Byzantium, this was the beginning of the end. These were the richest and most strategically important provinces of the empire. Their loss was devastating. And the empire, which had already been exhausted by war and disease, now found itself with an enemy it could not ignore. This wasn't just a military threat. This was a cultural and religious shift that would reframe the entire region for centuries. How did Byzantium survive all of this? Why didn't it fall then, when the empire had been stretched beyond its limits, its lands ripped away by war, disease, and new conquerors? The answer is complex. Byzantium didn't collapse in an instant. It didn't shatter overnight. It was a slow death, the gradual erosion of what had once been the mightiest empire in the Mediterranean. But in its decline, Byzantium adapted. And even in defeat, it found a way to endure. What we see now in Byzantium is not simply a defeated power. It is an empire in transition, holding on to its identity while adapting to the new world. It didn't collapse because it learned to survive in new ways. It didn't crumble because it outlasted the immediate threats. But the cost of survival was evident. The empire could no longer be the Roman world it once was. It had been forced to become something new, shaped by its enemies and its own survival instincts. What do you do when your gods, your gold, and your soldiers all fall silent? You adapt. You survive. And in that survival, the Byzantine Empire was born again. But what would it become in the years ahead? What do you do when your gods, your gold, and your soldiers all fall silent? When the ancient world that you inherited lies in ruins, and the imperial dream that once stood tall has been reduced to crumbling walls and fading hope. For Heraclius, the answer was to fight, to rebuild, to adapt. But the world he tried to save was already slipping away. And in his wake, a new world, one defined not by the glory of Rome but by the will of the desert, was rising. Heraclius had already faced the weight of the Persian invasion and the fall of the true cross. His empire, battered by years of war, was now growing smaller, its borders shrinking under the pressure of the expanding Arab Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire was caught in the middle, still bearing the crown of Roman imperial legitimacy, but barely holding on to its past. In 674, the Arab Caliphate, now unified under the banner of Islam, turned its eyes to Constantinople. The great city, protected by Theodosian walls, was a symbol of the Roman world, and the Muslims knew that to control the Mediterranean, they would need to conquer Constantinople. What followed was a brutal siege, one of the most intense in Byzantine history. For 4 years the city's gates were hammered, its walls tested, its resources drained. The enemy came from both land and sea, and the Arab fleet surrounded Constantinople, cutting off its trade routes and weakening its supply lines. But the city did not fall, not yet. What? The answer lay in a secret weapon, one that Heraclius had inherited from his military reforms: Greek fire. This incendiary weapon, launched from specially designed ships, burned fiercely on water, catching the enemy by surprise and decimating the Arab fleet. It was a game changer, a weapon so devastating that it turned the tide of the siege. The siege of Constantinople ended in 678, with the Arabs forced to retreat, defeated by Greek fire and the strength of the city's defenses. Heraclius's vision, his ambitious military reforms, had once again held the empire together, but at great cost. The empire had survived the siege, but it was exhausted, its manpower stretched thin and its resources drained. How did Byzantium survive this? Why didn't it collapse under the weight of the siege? Was it luck, or was it simply the strategic genius of a few good generals? What happens when an empire's firepower becomes its last hope? Heraclius had fought to protect the old world, but the new world was already knocking at the door. Islam wasn't just a military force, it was a cultural wave that would reshape the entire region. While the siege of Constantinople had been a victory, it had also highlighted the changing nature of the Byzantine world. The empire was no longer the same as it had been in the days of Justinian. The Byzantine identity was shifting, not just politically but culturally. The empire was shrinking both in terms of land and influence. Once proud cities like Alexandria and Carthage were lost to the Arabs, and the Mediterranean was no longer the Byzantine Sea. The Byzantine Empire, once the heir to Rome, was now a shadow of its former self, surrounded by enemies on all sides. But even as the empire shrank, the faith of its people grew stronger. Christianity, once struggling to define itself in the face of paganism and heresy, was now central to Byzantine life. The cult of saints flourished. Icons of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and local saints became cultural pillars, seen not just as spiritual symbols, but as beacons of hope in a world that was increasingly hostile. This was no longer just an empire, it was a Christian empire. The Church began to exercise more control with the emperor at its helm, but now the focus shifted. It was no longer about just ruling lands, it was about ruling the soul. The emperor, once seen as the protector of the empire, was now the protector of faith. Christianity was the glue that held Byzantium together as it shrank. But this shift came with consequences. As the emperor's divine role became more pronounced, the tension between secular and religious power began to grow. The empire's military decline paralleled the strengthening of the church, and the two forces often found themselves at odds. Why didn't Byzantium fall earlier? Was it because faith was a unifying force, or because the empire was stubborn in holding on to a vision of itself that no longer made sense? Heraclius's empire was shrinking, but it was also being redefined. Byzantium was no longer simply a continuation of the Roman Empire, it was becoming something new, something distinctly Christian. The shift from Latin to Greek had been the first sign. Now, the Church's dominance was reshaping the empire, and the Byzantine identity was becoming more theological than imperial. As the empire's boundaries shrank, the faith of the people in the villages grew stronger. This wasn't just about the emperor or the grand ceremonies in Constantinople. It was about local saints, icons, and rituals that connected people to the divine in their everyday lives. In the rural heart of Byzantium, peasants clung to their faith as the last thing that made sense in a world that seemed to be slipping into chaos. Icons became their spiritual anchors, placed on the walls of their homes, in their fields, by their hearths. These were not just religious artifacts. They were proof of survival, proof that God had not abandoned them. Saints like George and Nicholas became their protectors, their patrons in times of need. In a world where the emperor could no longer guarantee safety, these saints were the real rulers of the rural landscape. It was in these small moments, in these small acts of devotion, that the Byzantine soul was preserved. The grand imperial dreams of Heraclius had faded, but the faith of the people remained. It was in their icons, their village churches, and their prayers that the heart of Byzantium continued to beat. How could an empire survive so many external threats, so many internal tensions? Perhaps the answer was that Byzantium had shifted. It had become something else. It no longer relied solely on its military. It no longer relied on the grand dreams of emperors like Heraclius. It relied on the people, on their faith, their resilience, and their connection to something greater. But what did this mean for Byzantium? Could this new Christian empire hold on long enough to survive? Byzantium's survival wasn't about one great emperor. It was about the culture that had been built over centuries, a culture that was resilient, adaptable, and ultimately spiritual. The new world rising from the desert wasn't just Islam, it was a new way of thinking, a new identity that the old empire couldn't compete with. In a sense, Byzantium had died when the old world collapsed, and it had redefined itself as something new, something deeply spiritual and fiercely determined to survive. The question now was, what next? Could Byzantium continue to survive in this transformed world? Or would the next generation of rulers find that faith wasn't enough to protect them from the forces of change? Can you see God in paint and wood? Can the divine exist in the form of something crafted, something that can be touched and seen? Or does the sacred exist only in the unseen, the hidden, the divine beyond the image? On a cold, gray day in 726, the very heart of the Byzantine world was ripped apart. The Emperor Leo III sat in his throne room, staring at the sacred images, the icons that had adorned churches, homes, and hearts for centuries. And with a single violent decision he condemned them all. A theological war was about to erupt, a spiritual crisis that would divide the empire, tear apart communities, and cast the very soul of Byzantium into doubt. The icons had always been a central part of Byzantine worship. These were more than just decorations. They were windows to the divine, sacred images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, believed to bring the faithful closer to God. They were the lifeblood of Byzantine spirituality, the embodiment of a faith that saw the divine in the material world. But in 726, Leo III decreed the destruction of icons, a radical move that would shake the foundations of the empire. He believed that the veneration of images was tantamount to idolatry, and that the people needed to return to the pure worship of God without the physical medium of icons. For the people of Constantinople, this edict felt like a blow to the heart. The icons were sacred, divine even. To see them defaced, burned, and destroyed was like watching their connection to God vanish in an instant. Monasteries, homes, and churches across the empire were filled with weeping, with rage, with the sound of smashing wood and paint. The monastic communities that had long cared for and venerated these images now found themselves caught in a battle for their very faith. The monks fought back, refusing to surrender their sacred icons, even at the risk of their own lives. This wasn't just a theological war. This was a battle for the soul of Byzantium itself. The emperor's decree wasn't simply political, it was spiritual violence. The tearing down of icons wasn't just the destruction of images, it was the destruction of a way of life, of faith, of meaning. It was as if, in trying to purify the faith, Leo III was trying to rip the soul of Byzantium from its very people. What happens when the divine is torn away from the material world? Can faith survive without the symbols that connect us to it? Perhaps it was no coincidence that the empire, struggling to define itself, was now confronted with a battle over its identity. The icons had been part of the empire's fabric for centuries. They were the emotional core of Byzantine life. Could the emperor's edict, so cold and rational, truly erase what the people had worshipped for centuries? As the iconoclastic crisis deepened, the empire's heart seemed to weaken. But one woman, Empress Irene, refused to let the soul of Byzantium die. Irene, who ruled as regent for her son Constantine VI, took a stand that no one could have predicted. She restored the icons to their rightful place. In 787, Irene convened the Second Council of Nicaea, where she championed the veneration of icons, reversing Leo III's decree. The council declared that the icons were holy, and their destruction was blasphemy. Irene's strength, her courage to stand against the emperor's decision, and her devotion to orthodoxy became a turning point. She had seen the divisions, the violence, and the tearing apart of the church. Her reign, though short-lived, represented the return to orthodoxy and the reaffirmation of the power of the icons. But the battle for the soul of Byzantium was far from over. After Irene's reign, Theodora, the widow of Emperor Theophilus, carried the mantle forward. In 843, under Theodora's leadership, the icons were fully restored, and the triumph of orthodoxy was celebrated. The iconoclasts were defeated, and the icons, the sacred images, were returned to their rightful place in churches, homes, and hearts. These women were not just queens. They were guardians of the soul of Byzantium. How did the soul of Byzantium survive these crises? Could it truly have survived without the voices of women like Irene and Theodora? The battle for orthodoxy wasn't won by kings or emperors alone. It was fought by those who loved the faith, those who refused to see it torn apart, and who fought to preserve the divine in the material world. The icons weren't simply images, they were gateways to the divine. They were the tools through which the Byzantine people could commune with God, not in some distant abstract way, but in the most intimate physical sense. To destroy them wasn't just to destroy art, it was to destroy a way of life. The icons were woven into every fabric of life. In the marketplace, in the homes, in the churches, and in the monasteries. They were not just decorations, they were devotional aids, witnesses to the divine, and mirrors of the eternal. The act of venerating an icon wasn't worship of the image itself, but worship of what the image represented, the divine truth that it conveyed. In a world where the spiritual and the material were intertwined, art became not just aesthetic but sacred. Every brushstroke, every color on the canvas was a message, a reflection of God's will and presence on earth. When the emperor declared the destruction of icons, he was not just threatening religious tradition. He was threatening the devotion that the people found in these objects. Without the icons, what was left of Byzantium's spiritual soul? For the monks who had long dedicated their lives to the preservation of the faith, the iconoclast crisis was a battle for their very existence. Monasteries had been the heart of Byzantine Christianity, places of meditation, learning, and prayer. But with the iconoclast edict, the monks found themselves in a spiritual battle, forced to defend their images, their traditions, and their beliefs. Monasticism became the defender of the icons, and figures like the stylites, those ascetics who lived on pillars high above the world, to avoid the distractions of earthly life, became symbols of Byzantine spirituality. Mount Athos, the holy mountain, became a sanctuary of faith, a place where monks continued to worship, to preserve the old ways and to resist the iconoclast heresy. Monastic life was about survival, but it was also about maintaining a spiritual vision that had been passed down for generations. The monks stood not just for religion but for the soul of Byzantium itself. What happens when faith becomes a battleground? When belief is no longer just in the heart but in the image itself? The defenders of the icons were not just religious figures. They were custodians of Byzantium's identity. The icons were more than just images. They were the living connection between the people and the divine. And when the iconoclasts tried to destroy them, they were not only attacking the images, but the soul of an empire. In 843, the final victory of orthodoxy was achieved. After years of struggle, martyrdom, and spiritual warfare, the icons were restored, and the iconoclast controversy was put to rest. The triumph of orthodoxy was not just a religious victory, but a victory of identity. Byzantium, despite the chaos, had held on to its soul. In the streets of Constantinople, icons were restored to their rightful place. The veneration of images was now declared orthodox once again, and the people could finally breathe easy, knowing that the divine had been restored to their lives. But the cost had been high. Byzantium was never the same again. It had lost so much in the conflict. Faith, identity, and unity had been tested in ways that could never be undone. And in the end, the soul of Byzantium was forever shaped by the conflict over the icons. Faith, once pure, had been broken by heresy and rebellion. But in the restoration, Byzantium had found itself again. The icons weren't just art. They were the living testament of the empire's spiritual endurance, and through them the empire was reborn. In the silence of the 9th century, as the dust began to settle, something quiet returned to Byzantium. It wasn't grand or forceful. It wasn't the noise of battle, nor the shouts of victory. It was the soft whisper of recovery, the return of books, the rebuilding of roads, the quiet sunlight that warmed the once forgotten cities. What had been lost over centuries of invasion, plague, and war now crept back, not with fanfare but with fragile determination. Byzantium, battered by time and its own excesses, began to find itself again. And with each new layer of construction, every road repaired, every book translated and copied, the empire took another step toward rebirth. But this was no simple revival. This was a civilization crawling out of trauma, its soul scarred, its past haunting its future. The silence was hard-won and the recovery would not come easily. Yet in that quiet, the Macedonian Renaissance was born. A rebirth earned through blood, where the empire would reforge its identity, not as the empire it once was, but as the empire it was destined to become. The road to recovery wasn't easy, nor was it clear. But in 867, a man named Basil I rose to the throne, uniting a fractured empire under his rule. Basil wasn't born into royalty. He came from humble beginnings, and his rise to power was a tale of ambition, political cunning, and pure survival. His reign, and that of his descendants, marked the beginning of the Macedonian dynasty, a period that would revive the Byzantine Empire and lead it into its final cultural peak. Basil I's reign represented the centralization of power. Where previous emperors had been weakened by internal divisions, Basil's reforms brought a strong central authority, tightening control over the aristocracy and reasserting the emperor's supremacy. The themes, once military administrative districts with local power, were reorganized, making the central government stronger, and the influence of local military commanders more manageable. Under Basil and his successors, the empire began to see a cultural revival that was deeply intertwined with the Orthodox faith. Monasticism, which had long been a spiritual stronghold, now became a cultural force, preserving knowledge, translating ancient texts, and revitalizing Byzantine literature. The Macedonian Renaissance was as much a revival of faith as it was a rebirth of knowledge. Books that had been lost were now rediscovered, and the arts flourished, providing a counterpoint to the suffering that had marked earlier centuries. Why didn't Byzantium fall apart entirely? How did it survive the invasions, the plagues, the years of hardship? It wasn't just the luck of strong leadership or the presence of a capable ruler. Byzantium survived because it adapted. It found ways to persevere, to build, and to recreate the things it had lost. In the silent return of books, roads, and sunlight, Byzantium's soul found its way back, not to its past but to its future. Basil I's reforms went beyond military and political centralization. He understood that to revive Byzantium, it needed to re-establish law and order. The Basilica, a comprehensive legal code, was reformed under the Macedonian dynasty. This was the empire's legal backbone, solidifying the emperor's control over both the land and the people. But it wasn't just about the emperor's power, it was about ensuring justice in a system that had been badly fractured by aristocratic corruption. The peasantry, long the backbone of Byzantine society, found themselves under greater protection. The peasants' rights were reinforced, limiting the ability of powerful aristocrats to expropriate land or overtax those who farmed it. Basil understood that a stable empire depended on a stable rural economy, and by limiting the power of the aristocracy, he built a foundation for long-term recovery. These land reforms were also a way to address the growing tension between urban wealth and rural poverty. As cities like Constantinople grew, the empire faced the dilemma of balancing economic prosperity with social equity. By focusing on the protection of peasant land and redistributing wealth, Basil I laid the groundwork for an empire that was both economically strong and socially stable. For Byzantium to survive, it needed to maintain military strength, but not just any military. It needed a new kind of army, one suited to the challenges of the 9th and 10th centuries. Heraclius's reforms had already created the theme system, where provincial soldiers were given land in exchange for service. But Basil and his successors needed more. They needed a professional military, able to respond quickly to external threats while maintaining internal stability. The tagmata were elite soldiers, imperial guards who fought directly under the emperor's command. They were a response to the decentralization of the theme system. These soldiers were more mobile, better trained, and able to defend the empire's shifting borders. The cataphracts, heavy cavalry with armor that made them nearly impervious to attack, became a central part of the Byzantine military strength. But it wasn't just the army that changed. Byzantine warfare also saw a return to strategic thinking, with a focus on the frontiers, especially the Sassanid Persian threat in the east and the Muslim conquests in the south. Byzantine generals, particularly in the Balkans, made use of both fortified cities and mobile warfare, pushing back invaders and securing key regions for the empire. The cost of survival was high. The empire's military focus drained its resources, but it was necessary. The frontiers were still unstable, and the empire couldn't afford to lose what it had regained. Constant battles for territory made victory feel like a slow, grinding war, but it was the price that needed to be paid to preserve Byzantium's existence. What happens when you push an empire too far? Can Byzantium truly recover after everything it's been through? The empire survived because it adapted, yes. But the toll was heavy. The frontiers were always a battleground, and by the 10th century, Byzantium was still engaged in a slow process of reclaiming what had been lost. But was it enough? Despite the constant military and economic strain, Constantinople began to thrive once again under the Macedonian Renaissance. The population swelled. The guilds, organizations of tradespeople, became more powerful, creating a strong economic base for the empire. These guilds helped keep the city running, ensuring that the daily functions of commerce and craftsmanship continued, even during difficult times. The libraries of Constantinople flourished as well, as scholars sought to preserve ancient texts and revive classical knowledge. The Greek language became central to both the intellectual world and the imperial bureaucracy, cementing the transformation of the empire from its Roman roots into something distinctly Byzantine. The festivals in Constantinople were more than just celebrations. They were expressions of Byzantine identity. The Hippodrome became a place where the empire's public life was on full display, where the people gathered to witness both chariot races and the imperial ceremonies that symbolized Byzantium's continuity. For the first time in centuries, Constantinople felt like a living city again, a city of both power and culture. The Macedonian Renaissance wasn't just about Byzantium's internal recovery, it was also about exporting its culture and faith to the world around it. Cyril and Methodius, two Byzantine missionaries, embarked on a journey to spread orthodoxy to the Slavs in the 9th century. They created the Cyrillic alphabet, a system of writing that allowed the Slavs to read the Bible in their own language. This was a cultural revolution not just for the Slavs but for the entire Orthodox world. It solidified Byzantium's role as the spiritual center of Eastern Christianity. The spread of orthodoxy to the Slavs would have a lasting impact, helping to define Eastern Europe's religious identity for centuries to come. Was Byzantium's future still linked to its past? Or was it carving out something entirely new? By the 10th century, Byzantium had emerged from the rubble of centuries of turmoil. But it wasn't simply a return to the past. It was a rebuilding, a reimagining of what an empire could be in a changing world. The Macedonian Renaissance was a rebirth, not of Rome, but of something entirely unique, born of struggle, survival, and faith. In the shadows of history, there are moments that define an emperor, moments where the weight of an empire presses upon a single soul, and the path forward is carved not with compassion, but with cold precision. For Basil II, that moment came on a field of blood and tears, beneath the banner of Byzantine might. It began with a single order, an act so horrific, so calculated, that it would echo across centuries, carving his name into the annals of history: the blinding of the Bulgars. Basil had spent years facing the threat of Samuel of Bulgaria, the Bulgarian Tsar who had defied the Byzantines for decades. But it was after a crushing victory that the emperor enacted his final, terrible revenge. 15,000 prisoners, soldiers of Samuel's army, were blinded, leaving only 1 in every 100 with a single eye, so that they could guide their comrades back home. This wasn't just a punishment. This was Basil II's statement. It was ruthless, efficient, and it left no room for mercy. The Bulgar nation was broken, and in its destruction Basil's reputation was forged as the Bulgar Slayer, the man who never flinched, the emperor who saw his enemies not as people, but as problems to be solved. Basil II's reign was one of tactical brilliance and uncompromising resolve. He wasn't a man of passion, not a ruler driven by emotion or even the desire for glory. No, Basil ruled with a cold, calculated precision. His reign was marked by ruthless efficiency in both his military campaigns and his governance. While his contemporaries ruled with opulent ceremonies and grandiosity, Basil's strength lay in his humility and administrative genius. He wasn't a man of indulgence but one who understood the value of efficiency. His empire was held together not by the glamour of imperial riches, but by the tight grip of military discipline and well-managed bureaucracy. His military conquests, a series of devastating campaigns, were designed to bleed his enemies dry. There was no room for excess. Basil's armies marched not to conquer for glory, but to subjugate, to consume. The conquest of Bulgaria was just one example of how he operated, using the land and human resources at his disposal until they could offer no more. His mastery of military strategy was combined with a sharp administrative eye. Basil II reformed the imperial system by conducting imperial audits, tax registers, and enforcing peasant protection laws that maintained stability across the empire. His control was not just military but economic. He demanded order, and order was delivered. Why did Basil II adopt such a cold, almost heartless approach to power? Was it ambition alone? Or was there a deeper understanding of what empire required? The answer lies in survival. Basil II ruled an empire surrounded by enemies, an empire constantly under threat. The Byzantine Empire had fallen before, and its survival depended not on magnanimity but on ruthless consolidation of power. Basil understood that suffering, fear, and subjugation were the tools with which an empire was built, not just defended but strengthened. The Bulgarian War is the defining chapter of Basil II's reign. 4 years, the Bulgarians had harried the empire's borders, and despite early Byzantine victories, the Bulgarian rebellion persisted. Samuel's armies had taken Ohrid, one of the empire's most important spiritual and cultural centers, forcing the Byzantines to watch as their territory was slowly eroded. But Basil II's army was different. It was disciplined, methodical, and relentless. Under his leadership, the Byzantine forces not only regained lost territory, but they decimated the Bulgarian heartland. The ultimate punishment, the blinding of the Bulgarian prisoners, wasn't born from a desire for cruelty but from a calculated understanding that in order to secure Byzantine supremacy, no mercy could be shown to the enemy. The fall of Ohrid marked the end of Bulgarian resistance and the death of Samuel's vision for an independent Bulgaria. The price of victory, however, was exorbitant. The Bulgarian people, broken and humiliated, were left in a state from which they would never recover. But at what cost? What happens when victory becomes more important than humanity? Basil's empire was a machine of war, and while it survived, the soul of the empire was forever altered. Had Byzantium won its greatest victory, or had it crossed a line from which it could never return? Basil II's expansion wasn't confined to the Balkans. The eastern frontier was just as important, and here too he displayed his military brilliance. The Armenian highlands were a land of strategic value, both for its trade routes and its military positioning. The Armenian kingdom had been a loyal Byzantine ally for centuries, but its fragility left it vulnerable to both the Muslims and Byzantine incursions. Basil II understood the region's value and executed a campaign that brought Armenia into the imperial fold. Yet, his expansion wasn't just about adding territory to his reign, it was about securing the empire's eastern frontier. The Caucasus, once a bastion of local resistance to imperial control, was brought into line under Byzantine domination. Basil's forces, disciplined and ruthless, established fortresses along the frontier, securing the region for the long term. Through this, Basil II didn't just expand the empire, he laid the foundation for a Byzantine stronghold in the east that would last long after his death. The brilliance of Basil II's rule wasn't confined solely to military conquests. He also understood the value of the peasantry. After centuries of aristocratic exploitation, Basil II enacted land reforms that protected the peasantry from the excesses of the aristocracy. The peasantry was not only the backbone of Byzantine agriculture, but also the sustaining force of its army. His reforms were practical and ruthless. He created new tax registers, ensuring that peasants were protected from arbitrary taxation. But these reforms also served to centralize imperial control. The taxes were no longer paid directly to local landlords, but to the central bureaucracy, thus reducing the power of local elites. Basil II's policies were harsh, yet effective. They ensured the economic vitality of the empire for generations. Under Basil II, Orthodox Christianity flourished as both the spiritual and political heart of the empire. His reign witnessed the solidification of Christian faith as a tool of imperial unity. Basil supported the Church, ensuring its role as the moral center of Byzantine society, while also using it as a means to legitimize his rule. The Church was not just a spiritual institution. It was an imperial partner, reinforcing the idea that the emperor ruled by divine right. His reign also marked the height of Byzantine law. The Basilica, which Basil II continued to uphold, codified Roman and Byzantine legal traditions into a system that would define the legal landscape of the empire for centuries. Imperial symbolism was as important as military victory. Basil II's image was everywhere, etched into coins, etched into monuments, and solidifying the idea that Byzantium was still the heir of Rome, even when the rest of the world had moved on. What legacy does a ruler leave behind when their reign is defined not by compassion, but by cold precision? Basil II may have ruled with a ruthless hand, but he left behind an empire stronger than ever, immovable at its zenith. His legacy was one of uncompromising strength and absolute control. The Bulgarian conquests, the military reforms, and the peasant protection laws defined him as both a conqueror and a statesman. Yet, even in his triumph, he raised the question, what price did Byzantium pay to become immortal? Thank you to everyone who's joined us on this incredible journey through history. For those who have already subscribed, your support means the world. You're the reason we can continue to bring these untold stories to life. But if you're still on the fence, let me ask you, why hesitate? The legacy of empires, the stories that shape our present, are just a click away. You've seen the power of history, now it's your turn to make it part of your world. Are you really going to let these lessons slip by? The rise and fall of Byzantium, the shifting tides of power, these aren't just stories, they're warnings. You need this knowledge because history will repeat itself if we aren't paying attention. Don't wait until it's too late. Subscribe now and join the conversation, or if you choose not to, head to the comments and explain why you won't subscribe. Be honest. Let us know what's holding you back from diving into a deeper understanding of history. To our viewers, subscribers, and future subscribers, thank you for being part of this. Together, we're ensuring that history doesn't fade into the past. It lives on through us. Subscribe now or face the regret later. The choice is yours.